Nick Majerison here, welcome along to TopMedTalk, and this is a very special edition of TopMedTalk. It's in two parts, and this is part one. It was recorded at the Institute of Sport, Exercise and Health in London, live from an Enhanced Recovery After Surgery Leadership Forum. It features conversation between Professor Monty Mython and his two guests, Dr. Simeon West, a consultant anaesthetist at the University College London Hospitals, who sits on the board at Regional Anaesthesia UK, and Mark Harper, a consultant anaesthetist at Brighton and Sussex University Hospitals, with a research interest in the prevention of perioperative hypothermia and the use of cold water adaption for therapeutic purposes. They'll tell you more about that in a moment. But please remember, this is part one of two parts, so part two will follow next. And hope you enjoy it. Have a listen.
TopMedTalk. So welcome to TopMedTalk. I'm Monty Mython, Editor-in-Chief of TopMedTalk. We're here live from the Institute of Sport, Exercise and Health on Tottenham Court Road in central London. We've just had a wonderful day, an Enhanced Recovery After Surgery Leadership Forum. Got a great bunch of leaders in the room with us today, and our special panel who are about to introduce themselves, who've been lecturing today and or doing hands-on demonstrations. So I'm going to start with Simeon West. Simeon, tell us about yourself.
So I'm Simeon West. I'm one of the consultant anaesthetists at UCLH, and I've got an interest, nay a passion, in regional anaesthesia. I sit on the board of RAUK, and I very strongly believe in getting regional anaesthesia out to as many people as possible.
RAUK, is that the Royal Automobile Association?
It's not. I think if you Google it, it's got a few different societies. If you look, I think there's a badminton club somewhere there. But RAUK is the Regional Anaesthesia UK Society. We're the UK branch of ESRA.
ESRA, okay.
So ESRA is the European Society of Regional Anaesthesia, so it's the umbrella organisation for all the regional anaesthesia societies in Europe.
Okay, so one of our ambitions for this afternoon is to decode every TLA or FLA that we use to keep the abbreviations down so the whole world can understand what we're talking about. Sim, thank you very much indeed. Mark, tell us about yourself.
I'm Mark Harper. I'm a consultant anaesthetist in Brighton. I have a research interest. I have two main lines of research. One is in the prevention of perioperative hypothermia, and ironically, the other one is the use of cold water adaptation for therapeutic purposes.
So cold water adaptation for therapeutic purposes. I've heard in passing you talk about this, and I think you do this sort of open water swimming when it's freezing cold, which sounds a bit crazy to me, but you're suggesting that's good for you, is that right?
In the right measure, I am suggesting it's good for you.
How cold and how long?
You can go as cold or as long as you want. Actually, the interesting thing is that hypothermia is always bad. So if you've gone too long and you get hypothermic, that's actually going to be bad for you.
Hang on. If hypothermia is always bad, how can it be good for you?
You don't get hypothermic. You stay in long enough that you adapt to the cold, and adapt to the conditions, but you don't stay in too long that you become hypothermic. So
give us an example of where you might swim and for how long and wearing what to get this putative advantage.
You don't even need to swim in a pool. Mike Tipton, I work with down in Portsmouth, the Extreme Environments Lab, he's got a setup where he dunks you in a tank, and the classic dunking program is 6 dunks at 14 degrees, and you don't have to be in for very long. You just have to be in long enough that you bring your ventilation under control. That you can by the time you can hold your breath and control your breathing, that means that you have been in long enough.
I think I've seen some of that on the telly, but for the people who are thinking it might benefit their health, who enjoy swimming, what's the sort of accessible alternative?
In the UK, the accessible alternative is actually any open water. In Brighton, for example, in the summer, the temperature goes up to a maximum of around 20 degrees centigrade. And although you get more adaptation at a slightly lower temperature, at 20 degrees you still see maximal vasoconstriction. So it's having a significant effect on your physiology.
And how long might you swim for in open water to get a beneficial effect that you're suggesting?
I don't think you need to swim very long. As I say, just as long as you can get your breath under control, 5-10 minutes.
Okay, so what about just a daily dunking? Just get out there and sort of a bit of a refreshing get into the sea.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, this all sounds, well, one is, I've sort of noticed that people that go open water swimming look fit as a butcher's dog anyway. So has there any therapeutic benefit that you can separate from the fact that you're more likely to be quite active and fit if you do this?
We haven't, I can't say, it's not been separated out fully, and there are a lot of benefits. I always think of open water swimming as a kind of package of benefits. It's like being outside, which we know is independently is a benefit. It's exercise, which we know is good. It's a social activity. Well, it can be. Certainly the way I do it, it is. So you can't necessarily separate it out. However, there are people I know who have previously exercised, but have used it. As a good friend of mine, he's got inflammatory bowel disease, he's got Crohn's, and he has basically for the last 6-7 years, he's entirely controlled his bowel symptoms through cold water swimming.
So do you think, I mean, there's evidence, as I understand, from basic science that suggests that this is not crazy. You've had some hypotheses and others published in respectable journals, so it's not completely bonkers, this.
No, and there's good evidence. We've recently published a review in Experimental Physiology looking at the potential benefits. So it was Kill or Cure was the headline title of it. And we certainly came down on the side of cure.
So do you think it's worth anyone who's got a condition that isn't quite coming under control to at least have a look at this and perhaps give it a go? Would that be a reasonable... You're not in any way suggesting it's a proven therapy. You're saying it's something that may turn out to be that could help some people? Yeah,
exactly so. And certainly the big thing for me, I think what we're finding with all kinds of conditions is they're related to the levels of inflammation. And the big thing for me about cold water adaptation is that it reduces your levels of inflammation.
Okay. Do you think that's anything to do with why people in Scandinavian countries and the cold belt tend to be a little bit healthier than those in more temperate or warm climates? Or no, too much overthinking that one?
It's possible. Although I did notice recently there was a summary of nutritional advice which says it's not just the Mediterranean diet, but it's the Nordic diet as well, which is rich in oily fish, is actually good for you as well. So it might have something to do with that as well.
Okay, so bringing it back to the clinical scenario, what we were discussing today, you were presenting, we were looking at some great technology that can help us to stop this happening, is around the time of surgery, it's easy to get cold.
Completely, yeah. It's easy to get cold. First, when you just come into hospital, because you become a passive, patients become very passive. And you're just sitting around, you're in an air-conditioned environment, you can get cold, and certainly peripheries can get cold very quickly.
And anyone who's been a patient or even been in for tests will know it's quite hard actually to get enough thermal things. Everyone else is thinking about themselves in the environment who's working there, and the patients are often stripped off and barefooted or whatever it is and actually getting cold quite quickly. And that's not good for you, is it? You're not suggesting that's therapeutic? That's
not good for you. Again, you do not want to become hypothermic. You become cold. And the other problem with that, though, of course, is this business of core peripheral redistribution. Because the majority of cold, why patients get cold really in the first 30 minutes after an induction of anaesthesia is redistribution of heat from a warm periphery, from a warm core to a cold periphery. So it all equilibrates throughout the body.
Okay, so I'm at normal temperature in the majority of my body in the centre, but the edges have cooled off. So once you put me off to sleep, my natural mechanisms get overridden, and all the stuff rushes out into periphery, so all of me cools down. Is that right? And
the issue is that if your core is warm, and so you're sitting there with like really cold legs and really cold feet, if your core is warm, you'll actually probably feel reasonably warm as well.
So therefore, I think part of what you're suggesting earlier is a lot of effort should be put into keeping people's peripheries warm before we put them off to sleep.
Yes, I think that's it, and that's the thing about pre-warming. So the total body heat content is maximal, I suppose.
So we've spent for the last, as long as I can remember, I suppose it started 15, 20 years ago, we put a lot of effort into warming people when they're asleep on the table. But we've probably lost a lot of ground by that stage. So you're suggesting bring that forwards, is that right?
I'm suggesting do both. Okay. I think we need to warm them when they're on the table as well. But to really make progress, we need to bring it forward as well. But that's logistically slightly more complicated.
And practically at the moment, how do you do that? is it more complicated than duvets and blankets? And
it depends on at what stage your patient is at, really. If you get a duvet, if you insulate a patient, which is what a duvet would do, if you insulate them early enough and their periphery is nice and warm, that's absolutely fine. But by the time they've got cold, by the time the peripheries have got cold, by the time the total body heat has gone down, that will not be enough. You need to start putting active warming into the system.
So go back. So here I am. Let's skip over my age, size, and all that sort of thing. I've been in hospital in the last year or so. Arrive early, strip off, get one of those gowns that doesn't do up at the back, so your backside's sticking out. Have bare legs. Be told that something will happen to you in the next few hours. Stay in this bed space and remain a coiled spring, and you're gradually cooling. And that's fairly common, isn't it? I'm not exaggerating.
Yeah, fairly common.
So
absolutely. Very common. Too common.
So from the moment we do that, what should we be doing as an alternative?
I think there are two ways, two approaches. One is you can put active warming, so active external warming, which is, I think the most practical way of doing that currently are these self-warming blankets. The Easy Warm is the most common one. And then you put one of these, you crack them open, some iron oxide reacts with the air and they generate heat. In a very specific reaction, it will generate heat to about 38, 40 degrees. You put that around you and that will give you active warming and insulation. So that's one way of doing it. The other, which probably a bit more controversial, but I think from our studies of cold water immersion is really the way that would be most effective, is to keep active. And keep active either by walking around or get on an exercise bike. I really like to put exercise bikes in pre-operative areas and get people to, if they want, just go on. Just go and spin it a few times. Maybe put a podcast up so they can listen to a MedTalk podcast while they're doing it.
My recollection is once you've got the gown that doesn't fit on and your legs are bare or anything, if you sit down, you sit in a chair that's cold and your feet are on a linoleum floor that's cold, and I'm fairly well insulated and quite robust, but even after an hour and a half of that going on, you're feeling pretty chilled off. Sim, is this familiar territory?
Absolutely. I think we've certainly identified this as a problem in my place. We're little steps, and we've started putting active warming on all of the beds in the anaesthetic rooms, underneath blankets, and then so the bear huggers have started there, and the patients are now waiting there underneath the bear huggers. They've got a nice warm blanket at the very least, and then if they're really cold, we leave the bear hugger going. But I think pre-warming the patients in a dedicated environment would be even better. We've got these sort of poncho type blankets, which it would be great for some of these patients to try and keep them warmed. And I think we all identify those patients who you're struggling to heat up on table because they've got so cold.
And when you say the bear hugger thing, you mean a forced air warming system? A forced air warming
system of some description that then is put underneath the blanket on the trolley.
So for those people who are listening who are not working in this environment, it's effectively, I don't want to undermine the excellent work that's gone into developing it, but it's like a big hairdryer blowing hot air into nicely controlled blankets that keeps everything warm.
Absolutely.
And that's mainstream of what we've done in the operating room for a long time, but now you're suggesting bringing it forward.
Yeah, bringing it forward one step so that we can bring that warming process as early as we can in the patient journey. And the other thing is obviously trying to keep the patients clothed for as long a period as possible, trying to predict the timing of the operations such that we can keep them as closed as possible for the majority of time, and then only get them changed just at that right time.
Does anyone from our audience here want to come in on that point and the practicalities relate to that at this stage? Anyone want to chip in on that? Everyone think it's a good idea in the audience? Anyone think it's a crazy idea, never going to happen where they work? Or it sounds to me sensible, as though we should put some effort into it. And I said the bit that people often don't or take their eye off the ball is that redistribution thing. They think the core is warm, they forget the rapid redistribution. When we're in the operating room, I think we're pretty good in many places at getting the forced air warming systems out. But there's a reluctance sometimes to warm the fluids until you get into bigger cases. What's your threshold for warming fluids, Sim?
Excuse me. So, as a jobbing anaesthetist on that side, I have a couple of things available to me. I've either got a bunch of fluid in a warming cabinet, or I've got more active devices such as coil warming devices. And my personal rule of thumb is if I'm giving any more than a couple of litres, then I would pull out an active warming system. But I have no science to base that on.
Okay, Mark, where do you stand on that? What's your threshold for, or do you warm all fluids?
Don't warm all fluids. I think if you've got really short day case procedures, then with minimal blood loss, I'll give either not use fluids at all, which is one way of avoiding the problem, or stick to 500 mils. I'm a great fan of 500 mil bags. It's like really just kind of keeping a line open, being able to give drugs.
Do you keep them warm, your fluids, before you hang them, or do you think that's overrated? Because, I mean, if you leave them in room temperature, they'll be, 20 degrees Celsius if you're lucky? It's a big thermal sink, a litre of fluid.
Well, a litre of fluid is about 0.2 degrees to your core temperature, thereabouts. I would love to have that opportunity. So I think that's the way. For short procedures, 1 litre infusions, I think sticking them in a warming cabinet and just taking them from there is the most kind of cost and environmentally effective way of doing it. Much more than that, then move on to active inline warming.
Okay, so bigger cases, we've got no doubt, active inline warming of fluids, some form of on-table warming, and any new tips for the post-operative period? Again, we tend to strip people off straight away, get them onto a cold trolley and wheel them out into a relatively cold environment. Anything we can do there to make things better?
Pre-warm them. Really, it's prevention is better than cure, and I think the pre-warming thing have the most impact on that.
Immediately post-operatively, are you warming your trolleys and things like that? Because we tend to put them on a mixed sort of, a cold surface with cold bars on it, and it rapidly sucks.
Well, that's it. I think the technology we have that is probably best for doing that is, again, these self-warming blankets. They work really nice. You can just, if you're not using them intraoperatively, you just lay them on the bed. Yeah. And the things they're very robust. You can pull drapes off them and they don't rip. Yeah. So
simple measures.
It's simple measure, and then you can just keep that on the patient. And although they don't transfer heat as well as forced air warmer, they do transmit a significant amount of heat. And if you get them on early enough and you can keep them on afterwards, they can be really good.
Okay, any bad news in this world at the moment? Any overwarming, overheating, infection issues?
As far as I know, there's no evidence that overwarming has created complications. However, I think it is possible, it is easy to do, and I think this is one of the underrated benefits of measuring temperature. Measuring temperature. In fact, you're more likely to act. We're assuming everyone is warming people as well as they can, and I think you're more likely to act on overwarming someone by turning the heating off than by underwarming them, because you're just doing everything you can anyway. So
last little bit on this particular subject area, where and how do you measure temperature? Because this has been controversial forever. Nose, pharynx, blood, bladder, ears.
Well, I think perioperatively, what you should be doing is as we put out in the NICE guideline. You should be doing. You're not going to do direct measurements because you're not going to be putting pulmonary artery catheters in. So the next best thing is indirect measurements. So things like nasopharyngeal's good, sublingual's good. Zero flux is a new technology which can be used very easily in awake patients, and bladder temperatures as well.
And do you do core and peripheral? Or is that gone out of fashion? When I was a senior registrar back in the last century, that was quite popular to do T1 and T2.
I think core peripheral is intraoperatively is interesting information, but unlikely to change your management. Preoperatively, it might. If you've got big preoperative core peripheral gradient, that's a really strong indication to pre-warm that patient. And I think that's the way forward. That's how we need to be targeting our
Can you do that with a little stick, the sort of things you stick on kids to measure that? Can you put a little colour indicator, sticky tape thing
You
on?
could do, but you can just actually use those infrared thermometers.
Okay.
You have to put it on measurement mode. Because
Okay.
they've got measurement mode, which is the temperature it's actually reading.
Right.
And then they've got fudge factor mode, which is the temperature they think it might be.
Right. Okay. Sim?
I was going to ask, you mentioned earlier about thermal imaging cameras, and have you had any experience of those? And because they're coming down, they're cheaper in price, aren't they? You know, you can get one. We've got one now that we're looking in to see whether we can be predictive about how successful our blocks are with the sympathetic block. We see that emerge very, very quickly. But they're relatively cheap devices that you can attach to your iPhone. Have you had much experience of those with warming?
I haven't. There's somewhere I've got a lot of ideas about how they could be useful, and the iPhone ones are great as a general thing, but I think what you need is something that is really accurate. And to get one, I have looked into this, to get one which is accurate to about 0.1 degree plus or minus, you have to pay sort of more like around £1,000, which is still actually, as you say, it's come down a lot in price, but I think that would be really useful to have a properly accurate one. I think when you're looking at blocks, you just need to see trends, and I think
Absolutely.
the iPhone cameras, which I've also looked at, are good enough. Yeah.
Jen, I've got a question from the floor.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sangtani from Queen's Hospital. Thank you for giving a very useful information for keeping the patients warm. My question is actually, traditionally we keep the theatre temperature quite low, and do you think if kind of the temperatures of theatres are kept a little bit high than traditionally, will that help in preventing the hypothermia in the intraoperative period?
Yes, it will help. Every little bit helps, and I do think that will help. The thing is, if you can minimise the time that the patient is exposed to that cold temperature, then by getting the forced air warmer or whatever warmer you're using on very quickly, it might not be that important, and the not having grumpy surgeons may outweigh any benefits you're going to get from actually keeping the temperature high. But it will make a difference, but with careful management of the other aspects, it shouldn't necessarily have a big impact.
Coming to the zero flux, for the first time I came to know about it. It is very interesting, and he also mentioned it is very reliable, as good as a core temperature. My question is, though it is a bit expensive, can't we start using one probe, starting from the preoperative, intraoperative, recovery, back to the ward? And instead of putting there, if you put on the chest or somewhere else, then it is the same probe which you are using, the same procedure, it will be very accurate.
Yeah, you can do that, and you can just keep it on. As long as you've got a reader, you can just go from reader to reader. It takes about 5-10 minutes to equilibrate, because it has to create that window of warmth through to the subcutaneous tissues. But you could absolutely do that. It would be no problem at all.
Sorry, so we didn't quite catch your name.
Bhanumurthy from South Wales.
Excellent.
I'm one of the consultants.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed.
TopMedTalk. And there we conclude part 1. In part 2, you'll hear more questions from the people gathered at the Leadership Forum. Now, one way to make sure that you definitely hear that is to subscribe to this podcast. Simply click on subscribe via your podcatcher and make sure you hear every single episode of TopMedTalk.